Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. It began as an ordinary place, a quaint, peaceful neighborhood nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. The kind of place where every door was left unlocked and kids played until sundown without a care in the world. Neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, families gathered on porches to share stories as the cicadas droned in the background. But beneath this picturesque facade, something sinister had always lingered, a darkness so quiet and insidious that it took years for anyone to notice. I didn't grow up believing in monsters. They were the stuff of bedtime stories, conjured by adults to keep us out of trouble. But as I grew older, the whispers began, hushed conversations carried on the breeze at night, slipping through cracks in the walls like ghosts. I would hear my parents talk in strained voices when they thought I wasn't listening. It was always the same, another one gone. What's happening here? Disappearances. People vanishing without a trace. At first, it was a drifter no one knew too well, then a delivery driver who left his van running but was never seen again. The neighborhood chalked it up to bad luck or outsiders bringing trouble. We wanted to believe that we were safe, that whatever was happening wouldn't touch us. But deep down, everyone felt a gnawing fear growing like a cancer, too grotesque to face directly. I remember the first time I heard the rumors clearly, on an unseasonably cold evening. I was walking home from a friend's house, the streetlights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. Two old men stood on a corner, their voices low but urgent. "They say the Smith's house smells like rotting meat," one said, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "Not just the Smiths," the other replied. "It's spreading. People've seen them sneaking around at night. I'm telling you, something's wrong." I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. They saw me and fell silent immediately, their gazes heavy with unspoken warning. I hurried home that night, the shadows along the road seeming to stretch and reach for me. I didn't want to believe it, not at first. I wanted to cling to the image of our neighborhood as a safe haven, a bubble where bad things couldn't happen. But as the weeks turned into months, more whispers found their way to me. Mrs. Caldwell, the town's busybody, claimed she'd seen bloodstains on Mr. Smith's shirt. Old man Harris swore he saw someone dragging a heavy sack into their garage in the dead of night, the contents shifting unnaturally as if alive. It wasn't just the Smiths either. The Thompsons, 2 streets over, suddenly stopped inviting people to their weekly barbecues. And there was that strange smell, faint but persistent like copper and decay, wafting through the air whenever you passed certain houses. At first I thought it was all just gossip, exaggerated tales from bored minds, but then people started to disappear. The first was Miss Elkins, an elderly widow who lived alone. Her dog was found whining at the front door, but she was never seen again. Then came Greg, the friendly teenager who delivered groceries to shut-ins. His truck was found abandoned near the woods, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of him. It was like the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The police came, of course, asking questions, poking around. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no clues to follow, just silence. After a while, they stopped coming. It was as if they, too, were afraid of whatever was lurking in our midst. I started to notice things then, little things that made my skin crawl. The way the Smiths would stand in their front yard at odd hours, staring up at the moon, their faces pale and blank. The way the Thompsons' windows were always covered, even during the day, as if they had something to hide. And the way people avoided speaking their names, as if invoking them would bring some kind of curse. At night, I lay in bed, the unease gnawing at me like a living thing. My mind would replay snippets of conversations, fragmented and ominous. They're not like us. I heard they don't bury their dead. Sometimes I hear screaming from their basement. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger it grew, until it felt like the walls of my room were closing in on me. I began to keep track of the strange occurrences, writing them down in a journal. There were patterns. I realized specific nights when the odd behavior peaked, when the smells grew stronger, and the whispers turned into muffled cries. It always happened around the new moon, when the sky was at its darkest. Something was wrong in our neighborhood, something more horrifying than I could yet comprehend. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of a nightmare, about to be pulled into its depths. I didn't believe the rumors at first. I didn't want to. But the truth has a way of finding you, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. And in my case, the truth came with bloodstains, missing friends, and a darkness that refused to be ignored. It was a quiet Friday afternoon when the news broke. The kind of day where the sun filters lazily through the trees, and the world seems too calm for anything terrible to happen. I was sitting at the old wooden bench by the park, the same bench where my best friend, Mark, and I used to spend hours after school, sharing secrets, jokes, and dreams. Mark was the kind of person who made the world feel lighter. His laughter was infectious, the type that could pull you out of the darkest mood without even trying. He loved cheesy horror movies and always insisted on staying up late to watch them, despite the nightmares they gave him. I can still hear his voice, mocking me playfully when I covered my eyes during the gory parts. Don't be such a wimp, he'd say, his grin wide enough to rival the Cheshire Cat's. But on that Friday, Mark wasn't there to crack jokes or brighten the day. He was missing. I remember his mom calling me, her voice trembling so much that I could barely make out her words. "Have you seen Mark? He didn't come home last night." My heart sank. Mark wasn't the type to stay out late without telling someone. He was responsible, almost annoyingly so. The kind of guy who texted his mom if he was going to be 5 minutes late. I tried to reassure her, telling her he'd probably gotten caught up with something and lost track of time. But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. Mark wasn't careless, and he certainly wasn't the kind to disappear. The entire neighborhood rallied to search for him that weekend. Flyers with Mark's picture were plastered on every lamppost and storefront window. Groups of neighbors combed the woods, calling his name into the thick, suffocating silence. I joined them, clutching a flashlight as if its beam could somehow pierce the growing dread in my heart. As the hours turned into days, the mood began to shift. The hope that we'd find him alive slowly gave way to an unspoken fear. People started whispering behind closed doors, their voices heavy with suspicion and speculation. Maybe he ran away, someone suggested. What if he got into trouble? Another whispered. But I knew Mark better than anyone. He wouldn't have run away. He had no secrets, no reason to leave. Something had happened to him, I could feel it in my bones. In the days following his disappearance, I found myself haunted by memories of Mark. The time we built a treehouse in my backyard, only for it to collapse under our combined weight. The time he stood up to a bully for me in the 6th grade, even though he knew he'd get a black eye for it. And the time we promised under a pink-streaked sunset that we'd always have each other's backs, no matter what. Mark had this way of making life feel like an adventure, even on the dullest days. He used to say, "You've got to make your own fun in this boring little town." And he did, whether it was by organizing impromptu hide and seek games in the neighborhood or convincing me to explore the old abandoned house at the edge of town. Now every memory felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The laughter we shared, the plans we made, they all fell hollow, like echoes of a life that had been stolen from us too soon. At first, the neighborhood came together, united in their concern for Mark. But as the days dragged on with no leads, the cracks began to show. Fear does strange things to people. Some started locking their doors at night, a rarity in our small, close-knit community. Others whispered that maybe Mark wasn't the first to disappear, just the first anyone had noticed. Denial also took root. Kids go missing all the time, one neighbor said dismissively. He'll turn up. He probably just needed some space. They said it like it was nothing, like a 17-year-old vanishing without a trace was normal. But it wasn't normal, not here. Not in a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of surfacing like driftwood after a storm. And deep down, I think we all knew it. We just didn't want to admit it. A week after Mark disappeared, the police officially called off the search. No evidence of foul play, they said. We'll continue to investigate, they promised. But their words felt hollow, like they were just going through the motions. That's when the whispers about the neighbors started to grow louder. The Smiths, with their strange habits and unsettling smiles, became the center of every hushed conversation. They're hiding something, people said. I just know it. I didn't want to believe it at first. It felt too wild, too insane. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a question gnawed at the edges of my mind. What if they're right? What if the Smiths know what happened to Mark? The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its uneasy version of normal. But for me, life would never be the same. Mark's absence was a gaping wound, one that refused to heal. I stopped going to the park, stopped sitting on that old wooden bench. It felt wrong to be there without him, like I was trespassing on sacred ground. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him, where he had gone, and why no one seemed to care anymore. The world kept spinning, but I was stuck, trapped in the same moment, replaying the same questions over and over. They said time would make it easier, but they were wrong. Time only deepened the void, sharpened the questions. And as the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. A warning that something far darker was waiting for me in the shadows. At first, the nightmares were subtle. They crept into my mind like shadows at dusk, fleeting, half-formed images that vanished the moment I opened my eyes. But as the rumors about the neighbors grew darker, the dreams began to take shape, and with them came a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. It always started the same way. I'd find myself standing in the middle of the neighborhood, alone. The streets, once familiar, seemed twisted. Houses stood at impossible angles, and the trees leaned in as if listening. The air was heavy, filled with the metallic tang of blood. I could feel it, thick in my throat, choking me. The first vivid dream came just days after Mark's disappearance. In it, I was walking home late at night, the same route I'd taken countless times before. But something was different. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. The neighborhood, usually alive with a hum of cicadas and distant barking dogs, was unnervingly silent. I turned a corner and froze. There, in the middle of the road, was Mark. He stood with his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Relief flooded me. He was alive. But when I called his name, he didn't move. Slowly, he turned, and that's when I saw his face, or what was left of it. His eyes were hollow, his cheeks sunken, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, bloody teeth. He took a step toward me, and then another, his movements jerky and unnatural. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Just as he reached me, his hand outstretched and his smile widening to an impossible degree, I woke up drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The nightmares didn't stop there. If anything, they grew worse, more vivid and horrifying with each passing night. In one dream, I was being hunted through the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my skin like skeletal hands. I could hear them behind me, heavy footsteps, labored breathing, and a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't know what was chasing me, but I could feel their hunger. It wasn't just the kind of hunger you feel after skipping a meal. It was deeper, primal, an insatiable need to consume. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and as I turned to face my pursuers, I saw them. A group of shadowy figures, their faces obscured but their eyes glowing like embers. They surrounded me, their hands reaching out, their mouths opening to reveal rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. I woke up screaming, the sound of their laughter still echoing in my ears. As the days went on, I began to notice unsettling parallels between my nightmares and real life. The flickering streetlights, the unnatural silence, the oppressive feeling that something was always watching it all mirrored the eerie atmosphere of the neighborhood. Even the faces in my dreams bore an uncanny resemblance to the neighbors, the Smiths, the Thompsons, and others whose behavior had become increasingly strange. One night, I dreamt of the Smiths' basement. In the dream, I was standing at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. I could hear faint whispers, a chorus of voices calling my name. "Come closer," they said, their tone both inviting and menacing. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. At the bottom, I found myself in a room lit by a single, flickering bulb. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a body Mark's body. His chest rose and fell as if he were still alive, but when I stepped closer, his eyes snapped open. He grabbed my arm, his grip ice cold, and whispered, "They're coming for you." I woke up with a start, clutching my arm where his fingers had been. Even in the daylight, I could feel the chill of his touch lingering on my skin. I tried to dismiss the dreams as nothing more than the product of my overactive imagination, fueled by the fear and stress of Mark's disappearance. But the more they happened, the harder it became to ignore their significance. They felt too real, too vivid, as if they weren't dreams at all but glimpses into something far more sinister. The neighbors seemed to sense my growing unease. They'd watch me with those piercing, unblinking eyes, their expressions unreadable. One day, Mrs. Smith stopped me on the sidewalk. She smiled a wide, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "You've been having bad dreams, haven't you? You should be careful. Sometimes dreams can lead you places you don't want to go." Her words sent a chill down my spine. How did she know about the nightmares? I hadn't told anyone. Sleep became something I dreaded. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back into the twisted, nightmarish version of my world. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. I was jumpy, irritable, and constantly on edge. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to carry a hidden threat. The worst part was the growing sense that the dreams were trying to tell me something. They weren't just random images or fears, they were warnings. And if I didn't figure out what they meant, I knew I wouldn't survive whatever was coming next. I used to think nightmares were just that figments of a restless mind easily dismissed with the morning light. But these were different. These nightmares were alive, breathing, feeding on my fear. They were trying to show me something, to pull me into their darkness. And the more I resisted, the stronger they became. It was a night like any other, or so I told myself. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual hum of cicadas seemed unnaturally quiet, as if even nature had decided to hold its breath. I was walking home, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting its pale light over the familiar streets. The kind of light that doesn't reassure you but instead casts long shadows, turning the ordinary into something sinister. The first sign that something was wrong came when I passed the Smith's house. The smell hit me, a pungent, metallic stench that clawed at the back of my throat. It was faint but unmistakable, like copper in decay. I paused, my stomach churning, and glanced toward their property. That's when I saw it. The faint glow of a flickering light coming from their backyard, shifting shadows dancing across the windows. Something about it felt wrong. My heart quickened, a voice in my head screaming to keep walking, to mind my own business. But something else, a morbid curiosity, perhaps rooted me to the spot. As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic clinking of chains, followed by muffled screams. The sound was low at first, almost imperceptible, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more frantic. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the kind of sound you could easily explain away. It was the sound of someone in pain, someone desperate. I moved closer, my footsteps slow and hesitant, the gravel beneath my shoes crunching like a gunshot in the silence. The Smith's backyard was surrounded by a tall, weathered wooden fence, the kind that seemed designed to keep secrets in rather than keep prying eyes out. But through a gap in the planks, I could just make out the source of the light. A single bulb hung from a wire, swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. Beneath it, I saw movement, shadows writhing and shifting in ways that didn't seem entirely human. My breath caught as I spotted a hand, a pale, trembling hand clutching at the dirt before it was yanked back into the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then I noticed something else, a dark trail leading from the side of their house to the backyard. At first I thought it was water, but as I stepped closer, the metallic smell intensified, and the truth became horrifyingly clear. Blood. Thick, dark streaks of it smeared across the dirt, leading to the backyard like some grotesque breadcrumb trail. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat as I fought the urge to vomit. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, my legs trembling with the weight of what I was seeing. The clinking sound grew louder, accompanied by guttural growls that didn't sound entirely human. I pressed myself against the fence, peering through the gap once more. This time I saw them, figures moving in the shadows. There were at least 3 of them, their shapes distorted by the flickering light. They were dragging something or someone across the ground. I couldn't make out the details, but the way the figures moved was wrong. Their limbs seemed too long, their motions unnervingly fluid yet jerky at the same time. One of them stopped suddenly, its head snapping toward the fence as if it had sensed my presence. My breath hitched and I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. Its eyes gleaming and inhuman seemed to pierce through the wooden planks, locking onto me. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved, and then, as if dismissing me, it turned away, dragging its burden into the darkness. The muffled screams returned, sharper this time, cutting through the night like a blade. I could hear words now, pleas for help, desperate and heart-wrenching. Please don't, please. The voice broke into sobs, and then suddenly it stopped, cut off by a wet, sickening sound that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose stone. The sound of my fall seemed deafening, and for a moment I was sure they had heard me. But the backyard remained still, the only movement coming from the swaying bulb. I ran. I didn't think about where I was going or what I would do, I just ran. My legs carrying me as far from that house as they could. My chest burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop until I was safely inside my own home, locking the door behind me. For hours I sat in the dark, replaying what I had seen and heard. The blood, the chains, the inhuman figures, all of it felt like something out of a nightmare. But the stench of blood still lingered in my nostrils, and the sound of those screams echoed in my ears, a grim reminder that it had been real. That night changed everything. The whispers, the rumors, they were no longer just idle gossip. They were warnings, and I had ignored them. I had seen the truth, glimpsed the darkness that lay hidden in the heart of our neighborhood. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Whatever was happening at the Smith's house wasn't going to stop, not unless someone did something about it. But the question was, could I face that darkness again? I had always known the Smiths were strange, but I had never dared to confront them. That is, until the nightmares became too much to bear, and the bloodied images I had seen in their backyard refused to fade from my mind. I had to know the truth, even if the truth terrified me. It was a bright afternoon when I finally worked up the courage. The sun was deceptively warm, casting long shadows on their meticulously maintained lawn. Their house stood in stark contrast to the others in the neighborhood, its curtains always drawn, its porch immaculate yet devoid of life. No laughter, no music, no signs of anything normal. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I approached their front door slowly, rehearsing what I would say. My palms were slick with sweat, my heart hammering so loudly in my chest I was sure they'd hear it before I even knocked. When I finally raised my hand to the door, the sound of my knock seemed to echo unnaturally, as though the house itself swallowed the noise. The door creaked open just enough for Mrs. Smith to appear. She stood there, her frame unnaturally still, her pale face framed by thin, lifeless hair. Her eyes, those piercing, unblinking eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment I forgot how to speak. There was something in her gaze, something that felt like it could see straight through me, stripping away every layer of pretense and leaving me bare. "Yes," she said finally, her voice soft but devoid of warmth, like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. I forced a smile, my lips trembling as I tried to sound casual. "Hi, Mrs. Smith. I just wanted to stop by and say hello. It's been a while since we've talked." She tilted her head slightly, the movement sharp and bird-like, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to decipher some hidden meaning in my words. "Is that so?" she replied, her tone so flat it felt like a challenge. "Yes," I continued, my voice faltering. I was just wondering how things have been. You know, with everything going on in the neighborhood." Her lips twitched, pulling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Things have been just fine," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "We keep to ourselves. It's better that way." There was something about the way she said it, calm, almost rehearsed, that sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, trying to keep the conversation going. "That's good to hear. I've just been a little worried with all the disappearances and everything." At that, her expression shifted, her smile tightening as her eyes bore into mine. Disappearances? She echoed, her tone carrying an edge of mockery. People come and go all the time. It's the way of the world. Something about her words felt wrong, like a riddle wrapped in a warning. My mouth felt dry as I forced out my next question. Have you noticed anything strange? Any unusual noises or people around? Her smile widened, and for the first time I noticed how sharp her teeth looked, almost unnaturally so. Strange? Unusual? What a curious thing to ask. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes people hear what they want to hear, see what they want to see. Before I could respond, the door opened wider, and Mr. Smith stepped into view. He was a tall, gaunt man with sunken cheeks and the same piercing eyes as his wife. His presence was overwhelming, his stillness almost menacing. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Is there something we can help you with?" he asked finally, his voice deep and measured, as if he were choosing each word with care. I stammered, the weight of their combined gazes pressing down on me. "No, I just wanted to check in. Make sure everything's okay." He exchanged a glance with his wife, something unspoken passing between them. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that felt more like a threat than a gesture of kindness. "Everything is as it should be," he said, "but thank you for your concern. Not many people in this neighborhood take the time to care." As they spoke, I couldn't help but notice the little details that didn't add up. The faint smear of something dark, was it blood, on Mr. Smith's sleeve? The way Mrs. Smith's hands twitched at her sides, her fingers curling and uncurling like claws, and the faint, metallic smell that seemed to emanate from the house, growing stronger with each passing second. I tried to ignore it, tried to act normal, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. "Well," I said finally, forcing another shaky smile, "I should probably get going. I just wanted to stop by." "Of course," Mrs. Smith replied, her smile never faltering. "You're always welcome here. It's nice to know we have such a thoughtful neighbor." As I turned to leave, I felt their eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. I was halfway down the driveway when Mrs. Smith called out after me. "You know," she said, her voice carrying an almost playful lilt, "some things are better left alone. Curiosity has a way of getting people into trouble." I stopped, my heart pounding, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just nodded stiffly and kept walking, my legs trembling with every step. As I reached the street, I glanced back over my shoulder. They were still standing there, side by side, watching me. Their figures were silhouettes against the dim light from the house, but I could feel their gazes, sharp and unyielding. That encounter left me shaken. There was something about the Smiths, something I couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore. Their words, their behavior, even the air around them, it all felt wrong, as though they were playing a game only they understood. And as I walked away from their house, one thought consumed me: whatever they were hiding, it was more than just a secret. It was something dark, something dangerous, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The day started like any other quiet, uneventful morning that gave no indication of the storm to come. My sister Emily was her usual lively self, singing off-key in the kitchen while making her breakfast. At 16, she was the heart of our family, her laughter filling every corner of the house. I remember teasing her about the mismatched socks she was wearing, and she stuck her tongue out at me before heading off to meet a friend. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I'd see her smile. It was late afternoon when the first pangs of worry set in. Emily was supposed to be back hours ago, but she wasn't answering her phone. At first we tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd lost track of time or her phone had died. But as the minutes turned into hours, the unease grew heavier, settling over the house like a dark cloud. My mother's pacing became frantic, her voice breaking as she called Emily's name into the void of our empty home. By evening, worry had given way to panic. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the front door slamming as I ran outside, shouting her name into the growing darkness. "Emily, Emily, where are you?" My voice echoed down the empty streets, swallowed by the night. It wasn't long before the neighbors joined the search. Flashlights cut through the shadows as people called out her name. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, terribly, irreversibly wrong. My heart felt heavy, my mind racing with possibilities too horrifying to voice. And then, near the edge of the woods, we found it. Her backpack. It was lying on the ground, torn and dirty, as though it had been dragged through the mud. One strap was broken, and the contents were scattered: her water bottle, her notebook, her favorite pen with the glittering stars on it. My mother fell to her knees, clutching the backpack to her chest as sobs racked her body. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where are you?" As I helped her to her feet, something caught my eye: footprints, partially obscured but unmistakable, leading away from the spot. They weren't Emily's. They were larger, heavier, and headed directly toward the Smiths' property. My stomach churned as a cold realization washed over me. The Smiths. I had seen them watching Emily before, their stares lingering just a second too long. And now, standing there in the dim light of the flashlights, I couldn't ignore the connection. The bloodstains I had seen in their backyard, the chains, the screams, it all came flooding back. I turned to my mother, my voice shaking. "We need to go to the Smiths' house. Now." The neighbors followed us as we made our way to the Smiths' house, a small crowd fueled by equal parts fear and anger. My mother banged on their door with a force that made it shudder in its frame. "Open up." She screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Where's my daughter? Where's Emily?" For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Smith. She stood there, calm and composed, her pale face framed by the warm glow of the hallway behind her. She smiled, a chillingly serene expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good evening," she said, her voice unnervingly pleasant. "Is there something I can help you with?" My mother pushed forward, her hands trembling. "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" Mrs. Smith tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as if in thought. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," she said slowly. "We haven't seen Emily." Her words dripped with feigned innocence, but there was something in her eyes, a glint of amusement, like she was enjoying our suffering. Mr. Smith appeared then, his towering frame filling the doorway. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, his expression unreadable. "We understand your concern," he said, his deep voice measured and calm. "But you shouldn't go around accusing people without evidence." "Evidence?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "We found her backpack near your property. We know you've been hiding something. We know what you've been doing." His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unflinching. "Be careful," he said softly, his tone laced with menace. "Sometimes people see what they want to see. It's a dangerous habit." Despite their resistance, the crowd demanded to search the house. The Smiths stepped aside, their expressions passive, as if they had nothing to hide. We combed through every room, every closet, every corner. But there was nothing, no sign of Emily, no evidence of anything sinister. It was as if the house had been scrubbed clean of any trace of wrongdoing. As we left, defeated and hollow, Mrs. Smith stood on the porch, watching us with that same unsettling smile. "I do hope you find her," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It's such a terrible thing to lose someone you love." Back at home, the silence was suffocating. My mother sat at the kitchen table, clutching Emily's backpack like it was a lifeline, her tears falling silently. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, the weight of her absence pressing down on us like a physical force. And then came the guilt. I had seen the signs. I had known something was wrong with the Smiths, but I hadn't acted. I hadn't done enough to protect her. Now the nightmares I had been so desperate to escape were my reality. That night, everything changed. The whispers, the rumors, they weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings I had ignored until it was too late. My sister was gone, and the evidence pointed to the people I had feared the most. But if they thought I was going to let this go, they were wrong. I would find Emily, no matter what it took, even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. The house loomed before me, its silhouette black against the pale glow of the moon. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But I couldn't. Not with Emily still missing. Not with the horrifying images burned into my mind, the blood trail, the Smiths' cryptic smiles, their chilling calmness. This wasn't just fear anymore, it was desperation. My sister's life depended on me, and I couldn't afford to fail. I waited until the neighborhood was asleep, the world cloaked in the stillness of midnight. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and the gnawing determination in my gut, I crept toward their house. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of my dread pressing down on me. The Smiths' front yard was eerily immaculate, their flower beds perfectly pruned, the grass unnaturally green even in the dim light. It was as if the house itself wore a mask of normalcy, hiding the horrors that lay within. The back door was unlocked, just as I had hoped. The click of the latch echoed in the silence, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. When no sound came from within, I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. The air was thick with that same metallic stench I had smelled before, so strong now it made my stomach churn. The kitchen was dark and quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I moved cautiously, my flashlight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house seemed unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath. I had memorized the layout from my last search, but this time I wasn't here to look through drawers or closets. I was looking for something deeper, something hidden. I reached the hallway and noticed a faint draft coming from the floor near the pantry door. My fingers trembled as I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. The air that rose to meet me was cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. My flashlight flickered as I descended, the steps creaking beneath my weight. The basement was deeper than I had expected, the stairs seeming to stretch endlessly into the shadows. At the bottom I was met with a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that swung gently from the ceiling, casting grotesque, shifting shapes on the walls. The first thing I saw was the cages. They were crude, hastily constructed from rusted metal bars, their edges jagged and stained with blood. Inside them were scraps of clothing, broken chains, and other signs of struggle. My stomach turned as I realized what these cages were for. They weren't for animals, they were for people. And then I saw the remains. They were scattered across the floor, piles of bones picked clean and grotesquely arranged as if for some dark ritual. Skulls stared back at me with empty, accusing sockets, their jaws frozen in eternal screams. On the far wall, symbols were painted in blood grotesque, twisting shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them. I couldn't decipher their meaning, but their presence alone was enough to fill me with dread. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint, guttural sound that sent a chill racing down my spine. It was a low growl, deep and resonant, followed by the unmistakable sound of a muffled scream. My flashlight wavered as I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. The Smiths weren't alone. In the center of the room stood a creature, a monstrous, hulking figure that defied all logic. Its skin was pale and translucent, its veins pulsing with an unnatural black liquid. Its face was grotesque, a twisted amalgamation of human and beast, with sharp, glistening fangs that dripped with blood. Before it, slumped over a crude altar, was one of their captives, a young man, barely conscious, his eyes wide with terror. The Smiths stood on either side of him, their expressions serene as if this was nothing more than a routine chore. Mr. Smith held the man's head back, exposing his throat, while Mrs. Smith murmured something in a language I couldn't understand. Then, with one swift motion, she slashed the man's throat. Blood gushed from the wound, pooling on the altar and dripping onto the floor. The creature let out a guttural roar, its elongated tongue darting out to lap at the blood with a sickening eagerness. It drank deeply, its movements animalistic and frenzied, its glowing eyes rolling back in ecstasy. I backed away, my foot catching on something soft. When I looked down, I saw a severed hand, its fingers curled as if still clinging to life. Around me were other body parts, arms, legs, even a head with its mouth frozen mid-scream. They were arranged haphazardly, some stacked in a corner, others piled on makeshift tables. The air was thick with the stench of death, and my vision blurred as bile rose in my throat. I had to leave. I had to get out of there before they noticed me. As I turned to flee, my flashlight flickered, and the beam landed on Mrs. Smith. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. A slow smile spread across her blood-smeared face. "We were wondering when you'd join us," she said, her voice dripping with malice. I didn't wait for her to move. I ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the confined space. Behind me, I heard the creature roar, its heavy footsteps shaking the floor as it gave chase. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging as I scrambled up the stairs and out of the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. But even as I collapsed on my own front porch, I knew I wasn't safe. I had seen too much, and now they knew I was onto them. The Smiths weren't just monsters, they were something far worse. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Until they got me. The plan was simple, or at least that's what I told myself. I couldn't let fear paralyze me any longer. Emily was somewhere in that house, trapped with those monsters, and every second I hesitated brought her closer to a fate I couldn't bear to imagine. I had no choice but to act, no matter the risk. I spent the entire day preparing, gathering what little I thought would help. A flashlight, a crowbar, a rusty kitchen knife I had sharpened with trembling hands. They weren't much, but they were better than nothing. My only ally was the cover of night, the darkness that would hopefully hide me as I crept back into the Smith's lair. The house was eerily quiet when I arrived, its windows dark and lifeless, as though it were an empty shell. But I knew better. They were in there, waiting. The front door was locked this time, but I wasn't about to use it anyway. I had memorized the layout during the search days ago, and I knew about the small window in the back that led to the basement. It was cracked open just enough for me to slip through. Sliding in was easier than I expected, but as soon as I landed on the cold, damp floor of the basement, the metallic stench of blood hit me like a wave. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the space, careful to avoid stepping on the scattered remains that still haunted my nightmares. The cages were empty now, their doors swinging open as if mocking me. I made my way deeper into the basement, the faint sound of muffled sobbing guiding me like a beacon. My heart leapt when I saw her Emily, huddled in the corner of a cage that had been moved to the far wall. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but she was alive. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling with relief. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "It's me. I'm here to get you out." Her lips parted, but before she could respond, a low, sinister laugh echoed through the room. My blood ran cold as I turned to see Mrs. Smith standing at the top of the stairs, her face half lit by the flickering bulb. "You really are persistent, aren't you?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "It's almost admirable." I didn't have time to think. I rushed to the cage, fumbling with the lock as Emily whispered, "It's a trap. They knew you'd come." Before I could process her words, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the air. Mr. Smith emerged from the shadows, his towering frame blocking the only exit. His calm, predatory smile sent a chill down my spine. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble," he said, his deep voice resonating with a menacing edge. "But you're not leaving this time." I gripped the crowbar tightly as Mr. Smith stepped closer. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes gleaming with something inhuman. When I swung the crowbar, it connected with his arm and bent like it had struck solid steel. My stomach dropped as he chuckled, unfazed by the blow. "Is that the best you can do?" he sneered, grabbing the crowbar with one hand and yanking it from my grip like it was a toy. His strength was unnatural, his movements impossibly fast. He flung the crowbar aside, the clang echoing through the basement. Mrs. Smith descended the stairs, her slow, deliberate steps filling the air with dread. "We told you," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Some things are better left alone." I reached for the knife at my side, but before I could draw it, Mr. Smith grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off the ground with ease. His grip was vice-like, cutting off my air as I clawed at his hand, desperate for release. His eyes bore into mine, cold and unfeeling, as if he were savoring my fear. Emily screamed from her cage, her voice raw with desperation. "Let him go. Please let him go." Mrs. Smith approached, her smile widening. "It's almost a shame to waste him," she said, running a finger along the edge of the knife she now held. "But we all must make sacrifices." In a moment of desperation, I kicked out, my foot connecting with Mr. Smith's knee. He staggered, loosening his grip just enough for me to slip free. I hit the ground hard, gasping for air as I scrambled to my feet. Emily was screaming my name, but there was no time. I couldn't fight them, not like this. I grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the lock on Emily's cage. The wood splintered and the lock cracked, but it wasn't enough. Mr. Smith was already recovering, his laughter low and menacing as he stepped toward me. "Run," Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Just go." I didn't want to leave her. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay, to fight, to save her. But I knew I couldn't win. Not here. Not now. With a choked sob, I turned and fled, darting up the stairs as Mrs. Smith's laughter echoed behind me. The moment I hit the ground floor, I heard them coming. Their footsteps were impossibly fast, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. I threw open the back door and stumbled into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The Smiths' laughter followed me, mingling with guttural growls that didn't sound entirely human. I ran through the dark streets, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. Shadows seemed to close in around me, every sound amplified by my terror. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, collapsing against a tree as the adrenaline began to fade. I sat there, trembling and gasping for air, the weight of my failure crushing me. I had come so close, so painfully close, but I had underestimated them. The Smiths weren't just human, they were something far more dangerous, far more powerful. And they still had Emily. But this wasn't over. Not yet. I would find a way to fight them, to save her. I didn't know how, but I couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. They let me go that night, but it wasn't mercy. It was a warning. A message that I was powerless against them. But they underestimated me. They thought fear would break me, but all it did was fuel my resolve. I had failed once, but I wouldn't fail again. The fight wasn't over, and this time I wouldn't run. After barely escaping the Smith's lair, I was consumed by a volatile mix of fear, anger, and desperation. Emily was still trapped, and every second that passed felt like another nail in her coffin. I knew I couldn't face them alone. Their strength, their cunning, it was beyond anything I could have imagined. But there was one thing stronger than fear: unity. If I couldn't defeat them on my own, I'd have to rally the community. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. This was about the Smiths, their darkness, and the secrets they had buried in the heart of our neighborhood for far too long. That night I went door to door, knocking on each home with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. Some people opened their doors cautiously, their faces etched with suspicion and worry. Others refused to answer at all, peering out from behind curtains like they could already sense what I was about to ask of them. And meet me at the town hall, I told them, my voice trembling but resolute. We need to talk. About the Smiths. About Emily. About what's been happening here for far too long. Some nodded, their expressions grave, while others shook their heads, muttering excuses about not wanting to get involved. "You're stirring up trouble," one man said, his eyes darting nervously toward the Smith's house in the distance. "You should let it be." "I can't," I replied, my voice breaking, "and neither should you. They've taken enough from us. It's time we take it back." By the time I arrived at the town hall, a small crowd had gathered. Their faces were lit by the dim glow of flashlights and lanterns, casting long shadows that flickered across the walls. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes when people are forced to confront something they've tried to ignore for too long. I stood before them, my hands trembling as I gripped the edges of the table. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice echoing slightly in the room. "I know why you're scared. I am too. But if we don't act now, if we don't stand together, more of us will disappear. My sister Emily is still alive. I saw her, and I know they have her." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief and hushed whispers. I raised my voice to cut through the noise. "You've seen the signs. You've heard the whispers. You know what's been happening here, even if you've been too afraid to say it out loud. The Smiths are monsters, literal monsters, and if we don't stop them, they'll destroy us all." An older man, Mr. Harris, stepped forward, his face pale and lined with worry. "And what do you expect us to do, boy? They're not like us. We've all heard the stories. They're stronger, faster, smarter. Going after them is suicide." A woman in the back, clutching a rosary, chimed in, her voice shaking. "We don't even know what they are. What if we just make things worse?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know it won't be easy. I know we're scared, but there's strength in numbers. They may be powerful, but they're not invincible. If we work together, we can end this. Not just for Emily, but for everyone they've hurt, everyone they've taken. A younger man, David, who had lost his brother years ago under mysterious circumstances, stood up. "He's right," he said, his voice firm. "We've all lost someone. We've all felt the fear, the helplessness. But it's time we stop hiding. It's time we fight back." His words seemed to ignite something in the room. Heads began to nod, and voices grew louder as people shared their own stories of loss and suspicion. The fear was still there, but it was being tempered by something stronger: anger, determination, and the faint spark of hope. The discussion turned to action. People brought what they could: pitchforks, axes, crowbars, and old hunting rifles. The town priest arrived, carrying holy water and a Bible, his face set with grim resolve. "We'll need more than weapons," I said, recalling the Smiths' unnatural strength. "We'll need strategy, and we'll need to stick together, no matter what." Maps of the neighborhood were spread across the table as we planned our approach. We decided to surround the Smiths' house, cutting off any escape routes. The priest would lead the charge into the basement, armed with prayers and holy water to combat whatever darkness we encountered. As the meeting came to an end, the room fell into a heavy silence. People whispered their goodbyes, hugged their loved ones, and exchanged words of encouragement. The weight of what we were about to do hung over us, but there was no turning back. I stood at the front of the group, gripping a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. My heart was pounding, but I refused to let the fear consume me. I thought of Emily, her laughter, her smile, her unshakable belief in me. "This is it," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Whatever happens, we do this together. For our families, for our town, for everyone who's been hurt by them." The group nodded, their expressions grim but determined, and as we stepped out in the cold, dark night, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. We knew the risks. We knew the odds were against us. But in that moment, we weren't just a group of scared neighbors. We were a force, united by a shared purpose. And as we marched toward the Smith's house, weapons in hand, we were ready to face the darkness together. The air was thick with tension as we gathered in the shadows outside the Smiths' house. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. In the dim glow of flashlights and lanterns, I could see the resolve etched into every face around me. Mothers clutching makeshift weapons, fathers gripping tools with knuckles white from the pressure, and even teenagers armed with baseball bats and garden shears. We were a ragtag group of ordinary people, bound by fear and desperation, marching towards something far beyond our understanding. This was it, the moment we had been preparing for. The night we would face the monsters that had plagued our town for far too long. As we crept closer to the house, every step felt like an eternity. The Smiths' property was bathed in darkness, the windows like black, soulless eyes watching us approach. The smell of decay hit us long before we reached the door, a sickly, metallic stench that turned my stomach. The priest whispered a prayer under his breath, clutching a vial of holy water tightly in his hand. "We stick to the plan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No one goes in alone. We move as a group." The crowd murmured their agreement, though their fear was palpable. My own heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to focus. Emily was in there, and I wouldn't leave without her. The first group moved toward the back door, led by David, while the rest of us approached the front. I raised my crowbar and signaled for silence before motioning for the group to spread out. With a deep breath, I turned the knob. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of damp wood and rot. We stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The house felt alive, as though it were watching us, waiting for us to make the first move. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering in the light of our flashlights. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the muffled sound of movement upstairs. "Emily," I called out softly, my voice trembling. "Emily, are you here?" Before I could take another step, a blur of motion erupted from the shadows. Mrs. Smith appeared, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. She moved faster than any human should be able to, her bare feet silent against the floor as she lunged at us. "Welcome to our home," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. She grabbed the nearest man, a burly farmer, and threw him across the room as though he weighed nothing. He hit the wall with a sickening thud, slumping to the floor unconscious. The group erupted into chaos. People screamed as Mrs. Smith darted between us, her movements unnaturally fluid and fast. Someone swung a bat at her, but she caught it mid-swing, snapping it in half with a flick of her wrist. Her laughter rang out, cold and mocking. From the shadows, Mr. Smith emerged, his towering frame even more menacing in the dim light. His expression was calm, almost serene, as he grabbed two villagers and slammed their heads together with a sickening crack. Blood splattered across the walls as he stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with an inhuman light. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can't stop us." The crowd surged forward, shouting and swinging their weapons. The priest threw holy water at Mr. Smith, and for a moment it seemed to work. His skin sizzled where the water hit, and he let out a guttural roar of pain. But it only seemed to enrage him. He grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room, scattering the group. The fight descended into pandemonium. Mrs. Smith leapt onto a table, her laughter echoing through the room as she dodged every blow with ease. She grabbed a knife from the counter and slashed at anyone who got too close, her movements a blur. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith was a force of destruction, tearing through the group with terrifying strength. He flipped a table, sending people flying, and crushed a crowbar in his bare hands. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his smile never wavered. "They're not human," someone shouted, their voice filled with panic. In the midst of the chaos, I spotted the basement door. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. I knew Emily was down there. I shoved my way through the crowd, dodging Miss Smith's claw-like nails as she swiped at me. I reached the door and threw it open, descending the stairs two at a time. The basement was even worse than I remembered. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse and writhe, their blood-red lines glowing faintly. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the sound of muffled cries came from the far corner. Emily was there, chained to the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm here," I shouted, rushing toward her. Before I could reach her, Mrs. Smith appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face contorted with fury. She lunged at me, her claws outstretched, but I swung my crowbar with all my strength. It connected with her shoulder, sending her stumbling back. For the first time, her composure faltered, and her eyes burned with rage. "You'll pay for that," she snarled, her voice distorted and inhuman. Behind me, the priest and David burst into the basement, armed with holy water and torches. "Stay back," the priest shouted, throwing a vial of holy water at Mrs. Smith. It hit her chest, and she screamed, her skin sizzling and smoking. While the others held off the Smiths, I worked to free Emily, breaking the chains that bound her. She collapsed into my arms, too weak to stand. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." As we climbed the stairs, the sounds of the battle raged behind us. Villagers shouted, furniture shattered, and the Smiths roared with fury. I didn't look back. My only focus was getting Emily out alive. We burst through the front door into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The house behind us was in chaos, the windows glowing with an eerie light. The screams and crashes continued as more villagers poured in, their courage outweighing their fear. The raid was chaos, a brutal, bloody fight against forces we barely understood. The Smiths were monsters in every sense of the word, their strength and speed defying everything we thought possible. But we had something they didn't, each other. And for the first time, we weren't fighting alone. The battle had begun with a spark of hope, a collective resolve to fight back against the darkness that had plagued our town. But now, that hope was gone, extinguished like a candle in the wind. We were beaten, broken, and scattered, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt us forever. I stumbled out of the Smith's house, clutching Emily tightly to my chest. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale and streaked with tears. Behind me, the sounds of the battle were fading, replaced by cries of pain and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. The villagers were retreating, those who could still walk dragging the wounded behind them. The Smiths stood on the porch, watching us with cold, unfeeling eyes. Mr. Smith's towering frame was silhouetted against the dim glow of the house, his expression one of calm satisfaction. Mrs. Smith leaned against the doorframe, her face twisted into a smirk. "Run," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, "and don't come back. This is our town now." Her laughter followed us into the night, a chilling sound that seemed to echo in my very soul. We gathered in the clearing just outside the woods, far enough from the house to feel a shred of safety. The scene was one of devastation. Blood stained the ground, mingling with the dirt to create dark, sticky pools. The several villagers lay motionless, their bodies broken and battered. Those who had survived were slumped on the ground, their faces pale and hollow. The priest knelt beside one of the fallen, his hand shaking as he whispered a prayer. His Bible lay open on the ground, its pages smeared with blood. David sat nearby, cradling his arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes wide with shock. I looked around, searching for familiar faces, but many were missing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Some of them hadn't made it out. Mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters all gone, their lives snuffed out in the chaos. My mother sat on the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around Emily. Tears streamed down her face, silent but unrelenting. Emily was alive, but the light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. She clung to our mother like a lifeline, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I thought we could do it," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we could stop them." His words hung in the air, heavy with guilt and disbelief. One of the older men, his face lined with grief, shook his head. "They're not human," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something else, something we can't fight." The villagers' murmurs grew louder, their despair palpable. Some blamed themselves, others cursed at the Smiths, but most simply sat in silence, too broken to speak. I couldn't bring myself to join them. Instead, I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring back toward the Smiths' house. The faint glow of their porch light was still visible in the distance, a reminder of our failure. We had tried to fight, but we hadn't been enough. the weight of it all pressed down on me, threatening to crush me. I had led them into this, convinced them to stand and fight, and now their blood was on my hands. The screams of the dying echoed in my mind, each one a knife twisting in my chest. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "This isn't over," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. How could we fight something so powerful, so inhuman? How could we ever hope to win? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the villagers began to disperse, their heads hung low. Some swore they would leave the town, never to return. Others promised to protect their families, to never let the Smiths take another one of us. But for many, including myself, there was no resolution, only despair. The priest approached me, his face weary but resolute. "This isn't over," he said, echoing my own thoughts. "Evil doesn't win because it's strong. It wins because people give up. We can't give up." I nodded, though his words felt hollow. I wanted to believe him, but all I could feel was the crushing weight of defeat. As I looked back at the village, at the people who had fought so bravely and suffered so much, I knew one thing for certain: the Smiths weren't done with us. And next time we might not be so lucky. We had fought with everything we had, but it wasn't enough. The Smiths were stronger, faster, and far more sinister than we could have imagined. They had taken so much from us, and yet we had nothing to show for our efforts but broken bodies and shattered spirits. That night we learned the cost of defying the darkness. But even in the face of despair, I knew one thing: I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. Emily was safe for now, but the Smiths were still out there. And as long as they were, the fight wasn't over. The air was thick with desperation. After the failed raid and the devastation it left behind, hope seemed like a fleeting memory. The Smiths had proven themselves to be something far beyond human, something stronger, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. They weren't just monsters, they were embodiments of evil, and I knew we couldn't face them alone. That's when I remembered the whispers. Stories that had circulated in hushed tones for years. Tales of a man who had fought the darkness and lived to tell the tale. An exorcist, someone who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. He was my last hope. But finding the exorcist was no easy task. He lived far from town, deep in the woods where the trees grew so dense that sunlight barely penetrated during the day. The path to his home was treacherous, winding through uneven terrain and cloaked in perpetual shadows. The villagers had warned me about him. "Don't bother him," one woman said, clutching a rosary. "He's not like us. He's different." "He's cursed," another man muttered. "They say he's seen things no man should see." But I didn't care. Cursed or not, he was the only person who might know how to fight the Smiths. I set out at dusk, my resolve hardened by the memory of Emily's pale, trembling face and the cries of the villagers we'd lost. His cabin appeared out of nowhere, as if the forest itself had conspired to keep it hidden. It was a small, weathered structure, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and age. Strange symbols were carved into the doorframe and windows, some of them faintly glowing in the dark. A faint plume of smoke rose from the chimney, carrying with it the acrid scent of burning herbs. I hesitated at the doorstep, the weight of what I was about to ask pressing down on me. Taking a deep breath, I raised my hand and knocked. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the cabin were larger on the inside than it appeared. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man shrouded in shadow. He was tall and gaunt, his face lined with age and weariness. His eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to look straight through me, as though he could see the very essence of my soul. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. There was no warmth in his tone, only suspicion. "I need your help," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something in my town, something evil. It's taken people. It's taken my sister." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped back, motioning for me to enter. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a single, flickering lantern. The walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient tomes, jars of strange herbs, and objects I couldn't begin to identify. A large wooden table sat in the center, covered in symbols carved deep into its surface. The man gestured for me to sit. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his tone grim. "The kind of evil you're dealing with, it doesn't just die. It fights back, and it takes a piece of you every time." "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "They have my sister. They've killed people. We tried to stop them, but they're not human. I don't know what else to do." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've spent my life fighting things like this," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Demons, spirits, curses, you name it, I've faced it, but every battle leaves scars, and every very victory comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay that price?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes. Just help me save her." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But understand this, once we start, there's no turning back. The darkness won't just come for them, it'll come for us." He stood and began gathering supplies, moving with a sense of purpose that belied his earlier reluctance. He opened a large, leather-bound book and flipped through its pages, muttering words in a language I couldn't understand. From the shelves, he pulled vials of liquid that shimmered unnaturally, bundles of dried herbs, and a blade that glowed faintly under the lantern's light. "These," he said, holding up a small pouch, "are wards. They'll protect you if you're lucky. And this," he placed a heavy wooden crucifix in my hands. "This is your lifeline. Don't lose it." "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Smiths." "They're vessels," he said grimly. "Hosts for something ancient, something that feeds on fear and blood. They've made a pact with the darkness, and breaking it won't be easy. But it's not impossible." Before we left, he turned to me, his expression grave. "There's one thing you need to understand," he said. "The darkness will try to break you. It'll show you your worst fears, your deepest regrets. If you're not strong enough to face it, it will consume you. Are you sure you're ready for this?" I nodded, though the weight of his words settled heavily in my chest. "I don't have a choice," I said. "I have to save her." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Then let's end this." The exorcist was a man haunted by his past, reluctant to face the darkness again. But beneath his wariness was a resolve as strong as iron. He had seen the evil I was up against, and he knew the cost of fighting it. Together, we were stepping into the unknown, armed only with faith, determination, and the faint hope that we might survive what awaited us. The cabin transformed into a sanctuary of purpose, its once shadowy corners now alive with flickering light and the energy of preparation. The exorcist moved with practiced precision, his hands steady as he laid out an array of tools and relics on the heavy wooden table. Each item seemed to carry a weight of its own, steeped in history and power. This wasn't just preparation, it was a declaration of war against the darkness. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning herbs and melted wax. Symbols etched in salt and chalk now adorned the walls and floors, their intricate patterns seeming to pulse faintly in the dim light. Every movement, every sound carried a sense of urgency, as though the very fabric of the night were holding its breath. The exorcist began by carefully arranging the holy relics on the table, his voice low as he recited prayers in a language I couldn't understand. There was a silver crucifix, worn and tarnished from years of use, but still exuding a quiet strength. He placed it at the center of the table, surrounding it with small vials of holy water and jars of powders labeled in spidery handwriting. "This," he said, holding up a small, weathered medallion, "is a relic from a battlefield. Blessed by a saint, it has absorbed the prayers of countless souls. It may be the only thing keeping us from being completely consumed." Next, he produced a dagger, its blade shimmering faintly in the firelight. Symbols were etched along its surface, and the hilt was wrapped in worn leather. "This is for the heart of the darkness," he said, his tone grim. "It won't kill them outright, but it will weaken their hold on this world." He moved to a small cauldron set over the fire, where a mixture of herbs and oils simmered, releasing a pungent, almost intoxicating aroma. "This potion," he explained, stirring the mixture with a wooden ladle, "is a purifier. When burned, it will cleanse the air of their influence. It won't stop them, but it will slow them down." From a nearby shelf, he retrieved bundles of dried herb sage, rosemary, and something I couldn't identify. He bound them together with twine, muttering incantations under his breath before handing one to me. "Burn this if they get too close. It'll disrupt their connection to the darkness, but only for a moment." The exorcist cleared a space on the floor, sweeping away dust and debris before drawing a large circle in chalk. Inside the circle, he etched symbols with meticulous care, his movements almost reverent. "This is a ward," he said. "If things go wrong, get inside it and don't leave until I tell you. It won't hold them forever, but it will buy us time." As he worked, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening and shifting as though alive. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly, but the exorcist remained calm. He lit incense, its smoke curling through the air in delicate tendrils, and began to chant in a voice that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. Word of the exorcist preparations had spread, and soon the villagers began to arrive, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Some carried weapons, pitchforks, axes, and hammers, while others brought offerings of food, water, and supplies. The priest stood at the forefront, his Bible clutched tightly in his hands, his expression resolute. The exorcist addressed them with a quiet authority. "This fight is not just about one family or one town," he said. "It's about resisting the darkness that seeks to consume us all. Together we are stronger than they know. But you must be prepared for what's to come. This is not just a battle of strength, it is a battle of will." The villagers nodded, their courage bolstered by his words. Some knelt in prayer, while others exchanged solemn handshakes and embraces. For the first time since the raid, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile but unyielding spark that refused to be extinguished. As the preparations neared completion, the exorcist handed out small charms, simple wooden crosses, and iron amulets engraved with protective symbols. "Keep these close," he said. "They won't make you invincible, but they will shield you from the worst of their power." Finally, he turned to me, his gaze steady. "You'll need to lead the charge," he said. "They've taken your sister. They've taken your peace. And now you'll take it back." I nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on my shoulders, but beneath the fear, there was a growing resolve. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about standing up to the darkness, about refusing to let it win. The villagers spent the night gathered around the fire, their voices low as they shared stories and prayers. The exorcist worked tirelessly, his focus unbroken as he continued to refine his preparations. I sat with Emily, holding her hand and whispering reassurances I wasn't sure I believed. As dawn approached, the fire burned low, its embers casting a warm, flickering light over the weary faces of those who had come to fight. The exorcist stood, his silhouette framed by the glow. "It's time," he said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." We were ready, or as ready as we could be. The exorcist had armed us with relics, knowledge, and the faint hope that we might succeed. The night ahead would test us in ways we couldn't imagine, but for the first time we weren't alone. We were a force, united by purpose, standing on the edge of the abyss, and as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we stepped forward, ready to face whatever waited in the darkness. We returned to the Smith's house under the cover of night, our breaths visible in the unnaturally cold air. The exorcist led the way, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Behind him, the smaller group followed, faces pale, hands clutching relics, weapons, and torches. The oppressive silence was only broken by the sound of our footsteps, each step heavier than the last as we approached the heart of the darkness. The house stood in the distance like a shadow against the night, its silhouette warped and unnatural. It was no longer the ordinary home we had stormed before. It had changed, transformed into something alive, something malevolent. The windows glowed faintly with an eerie, pulsating red light, and the air around it felt heavy, almost suffocating. "This is their lair," the exorcist said quietly, his voice steady but laced with tension. "The darkness is strong here. Stay close. Do not let it separate us." As we drew closer, the house seemed to react to our presence. The ground beneath our feet trembled slightly, as if the earth itself was warning us to turn back. The faint glow in the windows grew brighter, illuminating streaks of dark, viscous liquid oozing down the walls like blood. The scent of decay was overpowering, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of iron. "Is it alive?" one of the villagers whispered, their voice trembling. The exorcist didn't answer. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the property, pulling a vial of holy water from his bag. He muttered an incantation under his breath and poured the liquid in a circle around us. The ground hissed where it touched, releasing faint wisps of smoke. "This will buy us some time," he said, "but it won't stop them." The door swung open before we reached it, creaking loudly as it revealed the darkness within. A cold gust of wind rushed out, carrying with it faint whispers and a chorus of disembodied voices. The walls inside were slick with blood, the crimson trails winding in impossible patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped further, the chill sinking into our bones. The oppressive darkness seemed to press against our skin, heavy and almost tangible. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe, and every sound, our footsteps, our breaths felt amplified, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "Stay together," the exorcist warned, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "This house will try to turn you against each other. Don't listen to it. Don't trust what you see." The house was no longer a house, it was a labyrinth. The walls seemed to stretch and twist as we moved, the hallways elongating into impossible distances. Doors appeared and disappeared, some slamming shut on their own, others creaking open to reveal glimpses of horrors beyond comprehension. I saw flashes of faces in the mirrors, pale, gaunt figures with hollow eyes that stared back at me with malice. The whispers grew louder, their words unintelligible but filled with anger and mockery. At one point, the floor beneath us shifted, the wood groaning as though it were alive. One of the villagers stumbled, his torch falling to the ground. As he bent to retrieve it, a hand skeletal and dripping with black ichor shot out from the floor, grabbing his wrist. He screamed, but the exorcist was faster. He hurled a vial of holy water at the hand, and it disintegrated with a hiss, releasing a foul-smelling smoke. "Keep moving," the exorcist barked, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. As we ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The walls were now covered in symbols painted with blood, their lines glowing faintly in the dark. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. At the center of the house, we found a room unlike any other. The floor was covered in a thick, black sludge that seemed to pulsate like a heartbeat. In the center of the room was an altar, carved from jagged stone and adorned with human bones. Blood dripped from its surface, pooling on the ground below. "This is it," the exorcist said, his voice grim. "The heart of their power. Destroying this will weaken them, but it won't be easy. They'll fight to protect it." As if on cue, the temperature plummeted, and the lights from our torches flickered and dimmed. The Smiths emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage and malice. They moved with an inhuman speed, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they circled us. "You shouldn't have come back," Mr. Smith growled, his voice layered with something guttural and inhuman. "This is our domain. You will not leave alive." Mrs. Smith let out a high-pitched laugh, her eyes glowing red. "You think your little relics can stop us? You're just meat ripe for the slaughter." The exorcist stepped forward, holding the silver crucifix high. "By the power of the divine, I banish you back to the darkness from which you came," he intoned, his voice resonating with authority. The crucifix glowed faintly, its light pushing back the shadows. The Smiths recoiled, but their expressions quickly turned to fury. "You will die screaming," Mrs. Smith hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. As they charged, the exorcist threw down a vial of holy water, and the room erupted in chaos. The house had become a living nightmare, a maze of darkness and despair. Every step brought us closer to the heart of the evil, but it also brought us closer to the Smiths and the horrors they had unleashed. As we prepared to fight, the air was heavy with the weight of what was to come. This was no longer just a battle, it was a war for our very souls. The room pulsated with a malevolent energy, the air thick and oppressive as though the darkness itself was alive. The Smiths stood before us, their bodies contorted and unnatural, their glowing eyes fixed on us with a hatred that seemed to burn through the very fabric of reality. This was no longer a fight against people, it was a confrontation with the demonic forces that controlled them, forces far older and more sinister than any of us could comprehend. The exorcist stepped forward, his presence a beacon of calm in the chaos. His hands gripped the silver crucifix tightly, and his voice rang out with an authority that seemed to cut through the oppressive darkness. "By the power of the divine," he intoned, "I command you to reveal your true form and leave this place." The exorcist began the ritual, his voice rising in a series of chants that echoed unnaturally in the room. The words were in a language I couldn't understand, ancient and guttural, but their power was undeniable. The room seemed to respond to the incantations, the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their lines shifting and twisting as if in protest. He produced a vial of holy water and flung it toward Mr. Smith, the liquid hissing and steaming as it made contact with his skin. Mr. Smith let out an unearthly roar, his body convulsing violently, his features distorted, his jaw stretching unnaturally wide to reveal rows of jagged, blackened teeth. His hands, now claw-like, tore at the air as if trying to rip apart the very space around him. "Leave him," the exorcist commanded, his voice unwavering. "You have no claim here." Mrs. Smith, standing in the corner, began to convulse, her body jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Her laughter, high-pitched and grating, filled the room, growing louder and more distorted until it was almost unbearable. She turned toward the exorcist, her eyes glowing red, and lunged at him with impossible speed. The exorcist raised his crucifix just in time. A blinding light erupted from the relic, slamming into her like a physical force. She was thrown back against the wall, her body writhing as if caught in an unseen fire. Smoke rose from her skin, and her screams reverberated through the room. "Your tricks won't save you," she spat, her voice layered with a deeper, guttural tone that didn't belong to her. "This vessel belongs to us." The room grew colder, and the shadows in the corners began to move, coalescing into forms that defied logic. These weren't just shadows, they were entities, their shapes flickering between the corporeal and the intangible. They towered over us, their faces obscured but their presence suffocating. The exorcist stood his ground, drawing a circle of salt around him and the group. "Stay within the circle," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. He opened a large, leather-bound book and began reading aloud, his chants rising in intensity as the demons roared in defiance. The Smiths' bodies twisted and contorted as the exorcist's words filled the room. They screamed and clawed at their own skin, dark, tar-like liquid oozing from their eyes and mouths. Their movements were erratic, like puppets controlled by a violent, unseen hand. One of the villagers, unable to bear the sight, broke the circle and rushed forward with a pitchfork. "Stay back," the exorcist shouted, but it was too late. Mr. Smith turned to the man, his face splitting into a grotesque grin. With a single swipe of his clawed hand, he sent the man flying across the room, his body slamming into the wall with a sickening crunch. "Do not let your fear consume you," the exorcist shouted. "It's what they feed on." The exorcist raised a dagger etched with holy symbols, its blade glinting in the dim light. He plunged it into the ground at the center of the room, the impact sending a shock wave of light rippling outward. The demons howled in pain, their forms flickering as if struggling to maintain their hold on this plane. "By the light of the divine, I banish you," the exorcist roared, his voice ringing with authority. He hurled another vial of holy water at Mrs. Smith, who let out an ear-piercing scream as her body convulsed violently. Black smoke poured from her mouth, rising into the air before dissipating with a final, mournful wail. Mr. Smith dropped to his knees, his body trembling as the exorcist turned his attention to him. The man's face was a mask of anguish, his voice barely a whisper as he pleaded, "Help me. It's inside me." The exorcist placed a hand on his forehead, his voice softening but still firm. "You are not alone. Fight it. You can reclaim your soul." The shadows in the room coalesced into a single, monstrous form, its eyes glowing with pure malice. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the very walls of the house. The exorcist stood his ground, his chants rising to a crescendo as he thrust the crucifix toward the entity. The light from the crucifix exploded outward, engulfing the room in blinding radiance. The demon howled, its form disintegrating into ash and smoke as the light consumed it. The house groaned, the walls cracking and splintering as the oppressive darkness began to lift. As the light faded, the room fell silent. The Smiths lay unconscious on the ground, their features softened, their bodies free of the grotesque distortions that had marked their possession. The villagers, though battered and shaken, stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them. The exorcist lowered the crucifix, his face pale and drawn but triumphant. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The darkness has been driven out for now." The battle was over, but the scars it left would remain forever. The Smiths were free, their humanity restored, but the cost of victory was etched into the faces of everyone in the room. The exorcist had won, but he had paid a price, one that none of us could fully understand. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a sense of relief tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The darkness may have been driven back, but it would always be waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. The room erupted into chaos as the weakened demons unleashed their fury. The walls shuddered, the ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the oppressive weight of their power. For every moment the exorcist's chant seemed to gain ground. The demons retaliated with terrifying strength, their inhuman forms lashing out with a ferocity that sent waves of fear through the room. This wasn't just a fight, it was a battle for survival, a desperate struggle against an evil that refused to be banished. The shadows coalesced into towering, monstrous forms that defied all logic, their limbs grotesquely elongated and their faces twisted into grotesque mockeries of human expressions. One of the entities let out an ear-piercing shriek, sending a shockwave through the room that knocked several villagers off their feet. A young man, barely older than 16, was flung across the room, his torch flying from his hand and extinguishing as it hit the floor. He scrambled to his feet, only to find himself face to face with one of the demons. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and a clawed hand reached out, but before it could strike, the priest hurled a vial of holy water at the creature. The liquid sizzled on contact, and the demon recoiled with a deafening roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Stay together," the exorcist shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not let them separate you." A villager armed with an axe swung wildly at another demon, the blade passing harmlessly through its intangible form. The creature lunged at him, its claws tearing through his arm, but before it could finish the attack, David, his arm still in a makeshift sling, charged forward with a pitchfork. He drove the weapon into the demon's center, its glowing eyes flickering as it let out a guttural howl. The victory was short-lived. Another demon emerged from the shadows, its massive form looming over the group. It struck with lightning speed, sending the pitchfork flying and knocking David to the ground. The villagers screamed, their panic palpable, but a woman, her face set with determination, stepped forward, holding a torch high. She thrust the flame into the demon's face, and it recoiled, its form flickering as though struggling to maintain its shape. The battle raged on, each villager forced to confront their deepest fears. An elderly man, his hands trembling, stood his ground as a smaller demon lunged toward him. With a shaking hand, he drew a small crucifix from his pocket and thrust it forward. The creature screeched, its movements faltering just long enough for the man to strike it with a crowbar. Another villager, a mother who had lost her son to the Smiths, took up a fallen weapon, a broken shovel, and swung it with a ferocity born of grief and rage. Her blows connected with one of the demons, forcing it back toward the circle of salt the exorcist had drawn. As it touched the edge, the creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its form dissolving into ash. At the center of it all stood the exorcist, his voice unwavering despite the chaos around him. His chants grew louder, the ancient words resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. He held the glowing crucifix high, its light pushing back the shadows, but the strain was evident in his face. Sweat poured down his brow, and his hands trembled, but he refused to falter. A massive demon, larger than the others, roared as it charged toward him, its claws extended. The exorcist barely dodged the attack, raising the crucifix just in time to block another swipe. The light from the relic flared, forcing the creature back, but it retaliated with a powerful strike that sent the exorcist crashing into the wall. He groaned, struggling to his feet as the demon prepared to strike again. "Help him," someone shouted, and the villagers surged forward as one. Armed with whatever they could find, they attacked the demon, their weapons and torches striking its flickering form. The creature roared, its movements slowing as the combined effort of the group forced it back. "Hold the line," David yelled, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. The villagers formed a protective barrier around the exorcist, giving him the time he needed to recover. The exorcist rose, his face pale but resolute. He held up a dagger inscribed with holy symbols, plunging it into the ground at the center of the room. A wave of energy erupted outward, slamming into the demons and forcing them back. They howled in pain, their forms flickering and distorting as the light engulfed them. One by one, the demons began to falter. The exorcist's chants grew louder, the relics and holy water weakening the creature's hold on the physical world. The villagers, emboldened by their small victories, pressed the attack, their fear replaced by a fierce determination. But the largest demon, the leader of the group, refused to yield. Its form towered over the others, its eyes burning with hatred. It let out a deafening roar, the sound shaking the walls and sending debris raining down from the ceiling. The exorcist locked eyes with it, his voice rising in a final, defiant prayer. The fight was brutal, each second a test of our strength and resolve. The demons were relentless, their power unmatched, but we refused to back down. Together, we stood against the darkness, our courage fueled by desperation and the faint hope that we might survive. As the exorcist's final chant filled the room, the demons began to falter, their forms flickering and fading. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time we could see a glimmer of victory. In the middle of the chaos, as the fight raged on around me, one thought burned brighter than all the rest: find Emily. The demons, the darkness, the horrors we were facing, all of it faded into the background. My sister was somewhere in this nightmare, and I wouldn't leave without her. With the exorcist and the villagers holding the line, I seized a moment to slip deeper into the lair, my flashlight flickering as I moved. Every step felt like an eternity, the oppressive air weighing down on me, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The corridors were a twisted maze of blood-stained walls and grotesque symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The floor beneath my feet was slick and uneven, and the sickly sweet stench of decay was overpowering. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, Emily, where are you?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft, broken cry. My stomach twisted as I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cries grew louder, more desperate, leading me to a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. I pushed the door open with trembling hands, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long shadows over the horrific scene before me. Emily was there, chained to a stone pillar in the center of the room. Her wrists and ankles were bound with thick, rusted shackles, and her face was pale and streaked with tears. "Emily," I shouted, rushing toward her. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "It's me. I'm here." "Don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They'll come back." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. I examined the chains, my hands shaking as I tried to find a way to break them. The metal was thick, the locks old and corroded, but they wouldn't budge. As I worked, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A low, guttural growl echoed behind me, and I froze. Slowly, I turned to see one of the demons standing in the doorway, its twisted form illuminated by the flickering light. Its eyes burned with hatred, and its jagged teeth gleamed as it let out a menacing snarl. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy piece of debris, and swung it with all my strength. The demon recoiled, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but I ducked just in time. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, positioning myself between Emily and the creature. "You're not taking her," I said through gritted teeth, my voice trembling but defiant. The demon hissed, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its hold on this world. Just as it lunged again, a blinding light filled the room, accompanied by the exorcist's voice shouting an incantation. The demon screamed, its body writhing before it dissolved into black smoke. The exorcist stepped into the room, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning me and Emily. "I'm fine," I said, turning back to the chains, "but we need to get her out of here." He nodded, pulling a dagger etched with holy symbols from his belt. "Stand back." With a quick, precise motion, he struck the locks on Emily's chains. The metal hissed and cracked, and the chains fell away, clattering to the floor. Emily collapsed into my arms, her body trembling uncontrollably. "It's okay," I whispered, holding her tightly. "You're safe now. I've got you." As we made our way back through the twisted corridors, the sounds of the battle grew louder. The walls seemed to close in around us, the shadows shifting and writhing as if trying to stop us. Emily clung to me, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting around in terror. The exorcist led the way, his presence a shield against the darkness. He paused occasionally to recite prayers, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Keep moving," he urged. "We're almost there." Just as we reached the main room, one of the larger demons appeared, blocking our path. It let out a deafening roar, its massive form towering over us. My grip on Emily tightened as I braced myself for another fight. The exorcist raised his crucifix, its light flaring brightly. "You will not take them," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The demon hesitated, its form flickering as if torn between advancing and retreating. With a final roar, it dissolved into smoke, leaving our path clear. We stumbled out of the house into the cool night air, the weight of the darkness lifting slightly as we left the lair behind. The villagers were waiting for us, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Emily collapsed into my mother's arms, her sobs breaking the silence. I fell to my knees, my body shaking as the adrenaline faded. The exorcist knelt beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly, "but this isn't over." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the house. Its windows no longer glowed, and the air around it felt less oppressive, but the sense of foreboding remained. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Emily was safe, but the scars of what she had endured and what we had faced would remain with us forever. The darkness had been driven back, but its presence still lingered, a reminder that it was never truly gone. For now we had survived, and for now that was enough. The room pulsed with an unbearable energy, the air vibrating with the tension of the battle's climax. The exorcist stood at the heart of the chaos, his voice rising above the din as he recited the final, climactic lines of his ritual. His words were sharp and precise, spoken in an ancient language that seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade. The demons, their forms flickering and unstable, shrieked in unison, their voices blending into a cacophony of rage and despair. The ground beneath us quaked, the walls bleeding a dark, viscous substance that pulled around our feet. The house itself seemed to fight back, its structure groaning and shuddering as if it were alive. "This is the end," the exorcist shouted, raising the glowing dagger high above his head. "By the power of the divine, I banish you from this world." With a final, deafening incantation, he plunged the dagger into the center of the altar. The impact sent a shock wave of blinding light radiating outward, engulfing the room and everyone in it. The demons let out unearthly howls, their forms disintegrating into ash and smoke as the light consumed them. The Smiths, still unconscious, writhed in agony as the darkness that had inhabited them was ripped away. Black smoke poured from their mouths and eyes, dissipating into the air with a mournful wail. The walls of the house cracked and splintered, pieces of wood and stone raining down around us. "Get out," the exorcist commanded, his voice hoarse but firm. "The house won't hold." We ran, the ground shaking beneath our feet as the house began to implode. The walls folded inward, the roof caving in with a thunderous crash. Behind us, the exorcist remained at the center of the chaos, his hands raised as he continued to chant. The light around him grew brighter, its intensity almost blinding. Just as we reached the door, there was a final, deafening explosion. A wave of heat and light surged outward, knocking us to the ground. When I looked back, the house was gone, reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint crackle of flames and the distant cries of night birds. The house was gone, its evil purged, but the cost of our victory was etched into the faces of everyone who had fought. The Smiths were free, but they lay still, their bodies frail and lifeless. And as the smoke cleared, the oppressive weight that had hung over our town lifted, leaving behind an eerie, almost unnatural silence. Dawn broke over the ruins of the Smith's house, its golden light casting long shadows over the broken ground. The villagers gathered in silence, their faces pale and weary. Some clung to each other, their relief tempered by the weight of their losses. Others knelt in prayer, their whispers a quiet tribute to those who hadn't made it. Emily sat beside me, her hand in mine, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fragile hope. She was safe, but the trauma of what she had endured lingered in her hollow eyes. I pulled her close, her trembling body a reminder of why we had fought so hard. The exorcist stood apart from the group, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of the house. He looked older now, the weight of the battle etched into the lines on his face. He turned to me, his expression grave but kind. "You've won a great victory today," he said, his voice quiet. "But the darkness is never truly gone. It waits, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. Be vigilant." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Protect your family. Protect your town. And remember, courage is the greatest weapon against evil." With that, he turned and walked away, his figure fading into the trees as the first rays of sunlight bathed the earth in warmth. The villagers began to disperse, their steps slow and heavy. Some paused to place makeshift markers at the edge of the ruins: a shoe, a hat, a piece of cloth silent tributes to those we had lost. My mother knelt beside one, her tears falling freely as she whispered a prayer. I sat with Emily under a tree, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. She rested her head on my shoulder, her breathing steady but shallow. "We're safe now," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "It's over." She didn't respond, but her hand tightened around mine, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. As we walked back to the village, the weight of what had happened settled over us. The Smiths had been victims, two puppets of a greater evil that had consumed them, and while we had destroyed their lair, the knowledge that such darkness existed would never leave us. The battle was won, but the scars it left would never fully heal. The village would rebuild, its people stronger and more united than before, but the memory of the darkness would linger, a reminder of the fragility of peace. And as I held Emily close, I made a silent vow. Never again would I let fear take root. Never again would I let the darkness win. The village was quiet again. The kind of quiet that should have brought peace. The ruins of the Smith's house had been left untouched. A grim monument to the battle we had fought. Life slowly began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be.